Portfolio holdings disclosure is not new. It's been in our market and in our industry for a long time. It's just the extent to which portfolios have been distributed, which I think is the case in point. I've been talking about portfolio holdings disclosure since around 2004, mainly with the asset management community at that stage, about trying to obtain portfolios. And I think a lot of that stems from, if you take that global perspective, we do a study every couple of years, starting in 2009. 21 markets. Australia and New Zealand still are the only two markets where there is no mandated level of portfolio holdings disclosure. Now, New Zealand, with their KiwiSaver schemes, come the end of this month, are going to start having portfolio holdings disclosure once a year, but it's being regulated in that market. So I think I come to this from a perspective of Australia does lag a lot of markets in terms of what we do around portfolio holdings disclosure. But I think the important point, and as Greg sort of already alluded to, you say those two words, what it actually means can vary quite a bit, and there is clearly quite a disparity around what people think about when they hear those words and what it should be. And I think later on, as we move through the presentation, we've all thought about this a lot, and I think we have some practical ideas. But if I can come back to that first point, why even have portfolio holdings disclosure? I don't think there's one key point that nails it. I think there's a number of points when you put them together which sort of create the argument. Start with your member, and just that very basic right. I think we would all agree if a member stands up, they're in a defined contribution plan, their future retirement earnings are dependent on the securities that you put inside their particular investment option. Can I have a copy of the securities that you're holding on my behalf, please? I think that's I think few people would argue that somebody who wants that information shouldn't be able to get it. I think that's a basic right and something that you build from, starting at the member. I think the other component, this is probably where the regulator comes from a little bit, it is about safeguarding the system. And when I say that, I don't mean that the regulators are going to get these portfolios, trawl through them, understand everything that's in there. What I do mean is, as soon as you put transparency into any form of investment, it raises the bar that people who want to play in that space have to jump over, and that's a good thing. When you look at the US, for example, going back to the financial crisis again, inside their registered or their mutual fund industry, which is governed by the SEC, there were no fund failures during the financial crisis. There was plenty of bad returns, but there were no fund failure. There was no particular failures. They have a high level of transparency inside that market. Quarterly portfolios are disclosed with a 60-day lag. So I think it helps to safeguard the system. Clearly the regulator, when they do want to be able to access that information, if it's already available and coming on a regular basis, it makes it easier for somebody to step in. But I think, as I said, it just raises the bar for everybody. And this superannuation is a big industry. And there's a lot of Australians dependent on it. I think the more we can do to safeguard it, that's got to be a good thing. And on that, as a similar theme, research and the role of research in this market, I think is another important element. So portfolios being disclosed, it's not just about being able to provide adequate information for members, it's also about creating a market or an area where the sorts of investment options we're putting up are well researched, because that creates confidence in those. And if you're starting from a point where portfolio of that degree of information is already available, the level of research and rigour of that research can operate at a much higher level than where we're standing at today. And lastly, I think when you put that information out, and just to look at another dimension of it, it's not just about the member or the trustee and what they do with that information. I've already talked about the research community and what they can do with that information to help advise their clients on what to do. But there's also the opportunity, if that information is available, to build a whole set of tools that people can use to report and bring to life the investment options that you're actually creating. That helps member engagement. At a time when, in my business, we deal with individual investors, we deal with institutions, we deal with advisors. The ability to actually bring to life portfolios by talking about what's in them is a huge benefit. And I think the fact that a lot of people look at these options don't understand that there's actually shares and real properties sitting underneath them is doing a big disservice to what we actually build and the sorts of portfolios that we build as an industry. I'm going to leave my remarks fairly short. I'd love to come back during question time to maybe talk a little bit more about it. But I think portfolio holdings disclosure, whilst there are a number of issues that we need to work through, once it's implemented, and we've seen this in other markets, it can actually lead to a more engaged market, a better industry overall. But there are challenges, aren't there?
There are indeed, and I think that you'll see I'm perhaps coming from a slightly different perspective to Anthony. But what I would like to do is focus on the risks of having a regulatory regime around portfolio holdings as opposed to transparency per se, and then look at what some of the consequences of those risks might be. And I see really there being three risks. Firstly, cost. Secondly, disengagement, so a different view to Anthony. And then finally, a potential for a detriment, in fact, on portfolio returns. So if you just like to think about cost for a moment, we have in Australia a fantastic retirement income system. It's rated the third best out of 20 by the Melbourne Mercer Global Pension Index. Now, it's not perfect, but it is a very, very great system. But it is imperative that we constantly evaluate the cost, efficiency and value add of what we are doing. And I think the fact that it's a compulsory system, in fact, imposes on us a higher obligation to make sure that we are delivering to members and investors value for money. So let's have a look at what the dollars might be around having a regulatory regime around portfolio holdings disclosure. The AIST submission estimates that the cost could be around $100,000 per fund. That was based on feedback from members. Now, it's a nice round number. I'm sure there was a degree of wetting the finger and putting it in the air there. But nevertheless, it is a cost. People are adding resources. Funds are hiring staff to focus on portfolio holdings disclosure. Not communication, not let's talk about, how can we communicate, risk and return of portfolios, but how can we actually, and how do we best just provide members with line-by-line portfolio holdings. So $100,000, I think the risk to that is probably on the upside. Secondly, I think there's a real risk that interest groups use the data that's published on websites to trawl for things that they don't like. And many of us in this room may also have some sympathy for some shareholder activism and things that we don't like to see in portfolios. But whether we're actually advertising and putting it on public websites, what's in portfolios, I think really creates the risk of distraction. Distraction for call centre staff who have to deal with these questions, but then also potentially distraction for senior management and boards as they have to hunker down and deal with interest groups that are really not there thinking about members and what's good for members, but in fact just pursuing a particular line. Now, I am aware of Dr. Bronwyn King's campaign on tobacco as a very admirable campaign, but I don't believe that it was line-by-line portfolio holdings disclosure that alerted her to the tobacco stocks in the portfolio. And wouldn't it be better if we actually just made a clear statement around if there are ethical considerations that we're taking into account in the portfolio rather than a line-by-line listing. And take, for example, Woolworths. Not many people would actually think about Woolworths as a gaming stock, and it's not, in fact, providing any insight or information to see that Woolworths might be in the portfolio, as opposed to having a clear statement around what a fund's view or position may be or may not be on gaming stocks. But I actually think the biggest cost and it's not measurable, is the cost of short-term behaviour and the risk of of a regulatory regime actually causing people to, chop between funds, chop and change as they see portfolio information, which is already out of date anyway. In response to what they're actually getting from the regime. So I think that risk of short-termism is something that we need to bat back on all fronts as an industry in the interests of long-term returns for members. So they're the costs. Just in terms of engagement, and this is where I have a different view to Anthony, and I think that the real risk is that we just flood members with too much information and that they in fact become less engaged. I ask you, is there any evidence from your members that they're not getting enough information from you? Or perhaps actually we need to provide more meaningful information. Portfolio holdings disclosure, the way it's being talked about, line by line, what stocks are in the portfolio, doesn't tell you anything about the risk and return characteristics of the portfolio that you are invested in. And I think that's very important. So, I think that there is a role for regulation when it involves consumer protection and system stability, but I don't see anything in the sorts of disclosure regimes that are being talked about that will in fact address consumer protection or system stability. And finally, just on the potential detriment to returns, I think that applies in both listed and in unlisted markets. If you focus for a moment on listed markets, and particularly in emerging markets or less liquid markets, why should our fund managers advertise to the world the positions that they have in the portfolio? So say you have an emerging market bond fund, there's a big position, for argument's sake, in Ireland. It's not a very liquid market. And we really need to tell the whole world and signal to the whole funds management universe that there's a position in this fund in a relatively illiquid market. And I accept that the 60-day lag does mitigate that to some extent, and the ability to blackline particular positions if they're commercially sensitive. I recognise that mitigates, but it doesn't in fact eliminate that risk that we start to be building portfolios or changing the way we're investing members' money in order to satisfy a regulatory regime that's got nothing to do with generating return. And in terms of unlisted markets, I think we're creating if we are being forced to disclose the book value of unlisted investments, then I think we're creating uneven obligations between super funds and other participants in the marketplace. So I think that there is a risk that having a regulatory regime will hinder investment performance. If funds want to use portfolio holdings or individual line-by-line stocks to illustrate, well, these are the sorts of things that we invest in. When we invest in Australian equities, yes, that involves investing in, BHP and the banks and so forth. Sure, there's nothing in the current regime that prevents funds from doing that, and competition, in fact, between funds will drive that. But I don't believe that we need a regulatory regime to drive that. Thanks.
Thanks, Maria. So I have the custodian's perspective. We're the ones who actually have to put the reporting together, which is interesting. So, from my perspective, we obviously are the primary source of book of record for investments. So we will spend a lot of time collecting the data, whether it's obviously directly held or indirectly held, putting it together, so slicing and dicing it, making sure that data is represented in a meaningful way to a fund to use with their members. So interesting for us. So I'm going to take a little bit of a step back and propose that we actually already have some look through. The APRA reporting regime that came into place last year, so to the 1st of July 2013. If you read closely, there is an element of look-through, and that look-through is actually one level down from your non-associated entity, which means that the regulator already, for prudential supervisory purposes, has already required funds to have look-through. Now, whilst they've given us a little leeway in terms of a runway to implement, I'd argue many of the custodians are actually out there trying to actually solve this problem in terms of getting this data. What was interesting actually for me last year, I think it was January, at a APRA roundtable with some industry bodies, is APRA already had the view that many funds already had this level of information at their fingertips. And for them it was a bit of a shock, and for many people in the room it was like, well, maybe it is actually a good idea that we actually collect this type of information and know what's really in some of those collective vehicles in particular. So I'd argue that there already is an element of look-through, but it's how that now looks and translates to members for disclosure that's going to be interesting. So if you just take a step back, the original exposure draft was a recursive look-through down to the end financial product. Now, what that actually meant is you could go layers and layers and layers down, 10 layers deep, into actually reporting what a fund actually held at a fund level, as well as a product level or investment choice for many of you, which I'd argue is a nightmare in terms of actually being able to report that at a point in time, using the right valuations at that point in time, and making sure you had apples to apples, that you were getting the information, you were digesting it, and processing through your systems, and making sure you were disclosing something the same way. So I'll give you an example that if you got data and it was a listed property trust, you were representing it correctly and in the same way consistently across the entire fund's portfolio. So that was an interesting problem I think many of the custodians and administrators faced with this type of reporting. And we actually set up a Australian Custodial Services Association task force to look at this. And our main aim was to promote consistency, to establish a set of data protocols, and to deal with this look-through, just how we were going to collect this look-through data. Firstly, for APRA reporting, and secondly for portfolio holdings disclosure, which at the moment is targeted to start 1 July this year. We created a template that actually is something that we would provide to fund managers or our RSEs clients to actually enable us to collect that data in a consistent format. So again, I'd argue that that's actually already out there, and many of you in this room, particularly fund managers, I'm sure have already seen that template. So from our perspective, we're definitely moving towards full disclosure, and portfolio holdings disclosure is just another element of that. And the question is, how do you want it to look? At a recent roundtable actually that we ran for many of our clients, and indeed some of our fund managers, so we had a mix of RSEs and fund managers, many of them weren't convinced of the fact that this actually provided them with a competitive advantage. There still hadn't been a lot of thought about just how big it would be, how they would place it on their website, how members could actually access it. Did they want graphs there? All that sort of stuff. So it's interesting that the thinking hasn't really started to evolve in terms of how am I going to use this. So the data it's definitely there, and we're definitely moving as a custodian industry to allow funds to access that data. What we need to do is pay more attention to how we want that data to look and feel, and what its purpose is going to be. Whether it's for, I understand prudential supervisory purposes are very different to, a fund being able to understand what they really have on a look-through basis when they look at their investments and make decisions, to what a member might want to see. And I argue maybe the three things are a little different, and that we need to have more debate around what are we trying to do with this data, because it's going to mean different things to different people. I'd just comment that the Treasury paper released last November, there were two options put on the table And they were interesting because the first option pretty much placed the obligation sort of 50-50 between the RSE to disclose their directly held investments. So for example, if you had an investment in a collective vehicle, you would be reporting just those units in that investment. And then the other side of the equation, which I'm sure Maria doesn't like so much, is the fund manager then, if they had an RSE invested in their collective investment vehicle, would actually report on their website. You know, from a personal perspective, trawling through that would be quite difficult. If I had put my member hat on, I'd have to go to maybe 50 websites to look at my particular fund and actually find out what I actually held if I was really interested in that. So that was quite interesting, that option. But easier to implement from a custodian's perspective, of course, because that data already exists. The second option was, actually a lot easier. It was reporting portfolio holdings disclosure for what you directly held as a fund, as well as anything that you had, so looking through your associated vehicles. And in theory, you should already have that data, and your custodian will definitely have that data. So again, a lot easier to implement, but I'd question the sort of value and lack of alignment with the current APRA reporting regime under that option as well. So I'm not sure if they're the best two options. They're the ones that are out there, but I'd argue they might be an even better option, which I'd like to throw out to the audience to see if you have been thinking about that, and whether there is still some time to come up as an industry with a better option rather than be handed down a set of regulations. I definitely would advocate self-regulation or self-reporting as opposed to being mandated something to do, because I think we're clever enough as an industry to have already thought through a lot of these things. I think what's interesting is when we definitely had a chat to many clients and discussed this internally, there are a lot of pros and cons to portfolio holdings disclosure. There are practical implications to think about. For example, consistency and alignment with Section 29QC, which is a nice little piece of legislation that says as a super fund you need to make sure your disclosure is consistent. So what you give to members and what you give to regulators has to be consistent. So I'm wondering where PHD will sit. I think the other thing, and I think Maria touched on, is what we're going to do with commercially sensitive assets. Do we mask those assets? How are we going to actually tell a member, actually I have 10 portfolios, but I don't really want to disclose what they are? Is that going to be more of a problem? Are you opening Pandora's box then? I think a couple of other things are around how are we going to disclose things like derivatives and complex instruments? If that's meant for a member to look at, I definitely know using my mum and dad test, that's very hard. They're going to start to see things like swaps and negative hedge positions. They're going to start thinking that their funds are taking a gamble or betting with currencies. So you might get some unintended consequence out of that. So that's again very interesting. So there are a number of, implementation issues that we need to think about as an industry to make sure we get the right outcome. And it's really essential, and as a custodian rep on this panel, to make sure the custodians are best armed to support the desired outcome that we all want to get to with respect to portfolio holdings disclosure.